The blood on the snow looked black in the dying light, and Xander Ingram knew whoever left that trail would not survive the night if he did not find them soon. He urged his horse forward through the blizzard that had swept down from the mountains without warning, the kind of sudden storm that claimed lives every winter in the Colorado Territory. It was December 1876, and Xander had been riding back to his ranch outside Loveland when he spotted the irregular tracks veering off the main road. At first, he thought it might be an injured animal, but the pattern was wrong. Someone was stumbling through the snow, and from the way the trail wavered and dipped, they were in serious trouble. The wind cut through his heavy coat as he followed the crimson spots that stood out against the white landscape. His horse, a sturdy bay mare named Copper, pushed through the deepening drifts with the determination of an animal that knew her way home and wanted to get there. But Xander could not ignore what he had seen. He had lost too many people in his 30 years to walk away from someone who needed help. The trail led him off the road and into a small grove of pines where the wind was slightly less vicious. That was when he saw her, a dark shape huddled against the trunk of a massive evergreen, half buried in snow that was accumulating by the minute. Xander dismounted quickly, his boots sinking into the powder as he rushed forward. She was a young woman, probably in her early 20s, with long dark hair that was matted with ice and blood. Her dress was torn and inadequate for the weather, just a thin cotton thing that might have been blue once but was now stained with mud and crimson. Her lips were turning purple, and when Xander knelt beside her and touched her neck to check for a pulse, her skin was cold as marble. But she was alive. Her pulse was faint and slow, but it was there. "Miss, can you hear me?" Xander kept his voice low and calm despite the urgency pounding through his veins. Her eyelids fluttered but did not open. There was a gash on her temple that had bled considerably, and her hands were scraped raw. She must have fallen from a horse or a wagon, maybe been thrown during an accident or an attack. Out here, both were equally possible. He knew he had no time for questions. The temperature was dropping fast, and the storm showed no signs of letting up. If he did not get her warm soon, she would die right here under this tree. Xander shrugged out of his heavy coat and wrapped it around her shivering form, then carefully lifted her into his arms. She weighed almost nothing, and he could feel her trembling even through the layers of fabric. Getting her onto his horse was a challenge, but Xander managed to pull himself up into the saddle and settle her across his lap, cradling her against his chest. She made a small sound of pain but did not wake. He wrapped his arms around her, using his own body to shield her from the worst of the wind, and urged Copper into motion. The ride back to his ranch felt endless. The snow was falling so thick he could barely see 10 feet ahead, and he had to trust Copper to find her way. His ranch was only about 3 miles from where he had found the woman, but in these conditions, it might as well have been 30. His fingers were going numb without his coat, and his face felt like it was being scraped with glass, but he kept the woman tucked close and warm. When the dark shape of his ranch house finally emerged from the white chaos, relief flooded through him so powerfully he almost felt dizzy. The house was modest but solid, built of timber and stone with a good roof and a stone chimney that he could see was still sending up a thin stream of smoke. He had banked the fire before leaving that morning, and it should still have some life in it. He managed to dismount without dropping his burden and carried her up the steps to his front door. Getting inside required some awkward maneuvering, but soon they were in the relative warmth of his main room, and he could kick the door shut behind them against the howling wind. The fire had burned down to embers, but Xander worked quickly to build it back up, adding kindling and logs until flames were crackling cheerfully in the hearth. Only then did he turn his full attention to the woman he had rescued. He carried her to his bedroom, the only real bedroom in the house, and laid her gently on his bed. The quilt was thick and warm, but he knew it would not be enough. He needed to get her out of those wet, frozen clothes and into something dry, then warm her up slowly. Too fast, and he could send her into shock. This was where things got complicated. Xander was a gentleman, raised by a good mother who had taught him to respect women, and undressing an unconscious stranger was not something he took lightly. But it was a matter of life and death, and he had seen enough people die of cold to know what had to be done. He worked as quickly and impersonally as possible, removing her ruined dress and the thin undergarments beneath. Her skin was mottled with cold, and he could see bruises forming along her ribs and arms. She had been through something terrible. He grabbed one of his own clean shirts and pulled it over her head, then wrapped her in every blanket he owned before placing her back on the bed close to the fireplace. Her pulse was still weak, but it seemed a bit stronger now. He cleaned the gash on her temple with water he warmed over the fire and bandaged it with strips of clean cloth. Her hands needed attention too, the scrapes cleaned and wrapped. As he worked, he found himself studying her face. Even battered and pale, she was beautiful in a way that made his chest tighten. Her features were delicate but strong, with high cheekbones and a determined chin. This was not a woman who gave up easily. Once he had done all he could, Xander sat back in a chair he had pulled close to the bed and simply watched her breathe. The storm continued to rage outside, and he knew he needed to go take care of Copper, but he found himself reluctant to leave his unexpected guest. She looked so fragile lying there, and he felt an irrational fear that if he looked away, she might simply stop breathing. Finally, he forced himself to his feet. Copper needed tending, and he needed to make sure the barn was secure. He stoked the fire high, made sure the woman was covered, and headed back out into the cold. The barn was a short walk from the house, but the wind was so strong it tried to push him off his feet. He got Copper settled in her stall with hay and water, checked on his other animals, a milk cow and a few chickens, and made sure everything was battened down. By the time he made it back to the house, he was half frozen himself. He changed into dry clothes and made himself check the woman again. She looked the same, still unconscious but breathing steadily. He heated up some stew he had made a few days earlier and forced himself to eat, though he was not particularly hungry. The adrenaline was wearing off, leaving him exhausted. As he sat by the fire eating his simple meal, Xander let himself wonder about the woman in his bed. Who was she? Where had she come from? What had happened to her out there on the road? Loveland was a small town, and he knew most of the families in the area. She was not local, or at least not that he recognized. Perhaps she had been traveling through with a wagon train or a stage, though it was late in the year for that. Most people had the sense not to travel through the Colorado Territory in December. He finished his meal and checked on her once more before settling himself on the floor near the fireplace with a blanket and his saddle for a pillow. It was not the most comfortable bed he had ever made, but he had slept in worse places. At least he was warm and dry. Sleep came in fits and starts. Every few hours, he would wake and check to make sure she was still breathing, still warm enough. Somewhere around dawn, he finally fell into a deeper sleep, exhausted by the events of the previous day. He woke to the sound of someone crying out. Xander was on his feet in an instant, his hand automatically going to the pistol he kept near where he slept. But the danger was not from an intruder. The woman on the bed was thrashing weakly, her head turning from side to side as she made small sounds of distress. Her eyes were still closed, but she was clearly caught in some kind of nightmare. He holstered the gun and moved to her side, placing a gentle hand on her shoulder. "Easy now," he said softly. "You are safe. Nobody is going to hurt you." His touch and voice seemed to calm her. The thrashing stopped, and she settled back into stillness, though her breathing remained quick and shallow. Xander dampened a cloth and wiped her face gently, noting that her skin felt warmer than it had the night before. That was a good sign. He was just turning away to rebuild the fire when he heard her speak. "Where am I?" The voice was hoarse and weak, but it was conscious and coherent. Xander turned back to find her eyes open, staring at him with a mixture of confusion and fear. They were green, he noticed, a deep forest green that was striking even in her battered state. "You are safe," he said again, keeping his voice low and calm. "My name is Xander Ingram. I found you yesterday during the storm under a tree about 3 miles from here. You were in bad shape, so I brought you back to my ranch. This is just outside Loveland, Colorado." She blinked slowly, processing this information. Her gaze moved around the room, taking in the rough timber walls, the fireplace, the simple furnishings. When her eyes came back to him, some of the fear had faded, replaced by wariness. "I do not remember," she said quietly. "I remember riding and then something spooked my horse. I think I fell. After that, everything is blank." "You took a good knock to the head," Xander said. "And you were half frozen when I found you. It is a miracle you are alive." He moved closer, but not too close, aware that he was a stranger and she was in a vulnerable position. "What is your name?" She started to shake her head, then winced at the pain. "Julia," she said after a moment. "Julia Reeves. I was traveling to Loveland. My uncle lives there, or he did. John Reeves. Do you know him?" Xander felt his stomach sink. He knew John Reeves, or rather, he knew of him. The man had owned a small farm about 5 miles outside of town, had owned past tense. "Miss Reeves," he said carefully, "I am afraid I have some bad news. John Reeves passed away about 3 weeks ago. Heart gave out, the doctor said. He went peacefully in his sleep." The color drained from Julia's face, making her look even more fragile. "Dead," she whispered, "but he cannot be. I came all the way from Kansas to live with him. He sent me a letter, said I could make a new start here after my parents died." "I am sorry," Xander said, and he meant it. "When did your parents pass?" 6 months ago. Cholera." Her voice was flat now, emotionless in the way of someone who had already used up all their tears. "I had been living with my aunt in Kansas, but she made it clear I was not welcome to stay. I had nowhere else to go. Uncle John was my only family left." Xander absorbed this, his mind already working through the implications. This woman had traveled all the way from Kansas in the winter, alone from the looks of it, only to find that her last living relative was dead and she had nothing. No wonder she had been on that road alone during a storm. She probably had not known where else to go. "You need to rest," he said finally. "You are not well enough to be worrying about any of this right now. When you are stronger, we will figure something out." "Figure what out?" There was an edge of desperation in her voice now. "I have nothing. Uncle John was my last hope. I have a little money, but not much. Not enough to get back to Kansas even if there was anything for me there." "Miss Reeves, you nearly died yesterday. Right now, the only thing you need to worry about is getting better. The rest can wait." She looked like she wanted to argue, but her eyes were already drooping with exhaustion. The brief conversation had taken most of her energy. "Thank you," she said quietly, "for saving me. I owe you my life." "You do not owe me anything," Xander said. "Any decent person would have done the same." She was asleep again before she could respond, her breathing evening out into the slow rhythm of slumber. Xander stood there for a moment, looking down at her and feeling the weight of responsibility settling onto his shoulders. He had saved her life, but what happened now? She had nowhere to go and no one to turn to. In a town like Loveland, a young woman alone with no family and no resources had very few options, and most of them were not good. He pushed the thoughts aside for the moment and went to make breakfast. The storm had passed during the night, and when he looked out the window, he saw a world transformed into white silence. The snow was at least 2 feet deep, with drifts piled much higher in places. He would need to dig out the barn and make sure the animals were all right, but first, he needed food and coffee. As he worked, his mind kept circling back to Julia Reeves. He could take her into town once she was well enough to travel, but then what? He had some friends there who might be able to help her find work, perhaps as a seamstress or a schoolteacher if she had the education for it. But jobs for women were scarce, and she would need somewhere to stay. The coffee was just starting to boil when he heard her call out again. This time it was not a nightmare. She was awake and calling his name or trying to. It came out more as Mr. Ingram, and her voice cracked halfway through. He poured water into a tin cup and brought it to her. She struggled to sit up and he helped her, propping pillows behind her back. She took the water gratefully and drank in small sips. "How are you feeling?" he asked. "Like I was trampled by a horse," she said, but there was a hint of humor in her voice that had not been there before. "Everything hurts. You were pretty beaten up. But nothing seems to be broken, which is something." He pulled the chair closer to the bed and sat down. "You said you were coming from Kansas. Were you traveling alone?" She nodded, looking down at the cup in her hands. "I know it was foolish. Everyone told me so. But I had enough money for a train ticket to Denver and a stage from there to Loveland. I thought I would be safe enough on the stage, but we got delayed in Denver because of the weather. I waited for a week, but the stage kept getting postponed and my money was running out. I could not afford to keep paying for a room at the boarding house. So you decided to ride. I bought a horse, or rather, an old mare that was the only thing I could afford. The stable owner said she was gentle and knew the road to Loveland. I thought I could make it in a day if I started early." She looked up at him and he could see the shame in her eyes. "I know it was stupid. I just did not know what else to do." "You were desperate," Xander said. "Desperate people do what they have to do. What happened to the horse?" She spooked at something, I think. "Maybe a snake or a rabbit, I do not know. I am not a very experienced rider. When she reared up, I fell and she ran off. I tried to walk, but I was not sure which direction to go. Then the storm hit and I just tried to find shelter. You are lucky I came along when I did." "I know." She met his eyes, and the gratitude there was so raw it made him uncomfortable. "I thought I was going to die under that tree. I remember thinking how stupid it was to come all this way just to freeze to death alone. And then I woke up here, and you had saved me." Xander shifted in his chair, not sure how to respond to that level of honest emotion. "You need to eat something," he said, changing the subject. "I made some stew yesterday. It is not fancy, but it will put some strength back in you." He brought her a bowl of the reheated stew and watched as she ate slowly, her hands shaking slightly as she lifted the spoon. She managed about half the bowl before shaking her head. "I cannot eat any more," she said, "but thank you, it was good. You can have more later. Right now you need to rest." She nodded, settling back against the pillows. But instead of closing her eyes, she watched him as he moved around the room, tidying up and adding more wood to the fire. "Mr. Ingram," she said after a while, "what am I going to do?" He had been dreading that question. "I have been thinking about that," he admitted. "Once you are well enough, I can take you into Loveland. I know some people there. Maybe we can find you a situation, some kind of work and a place to stay." "What kind of work could I do?" She did not sound hopeful. "I can read and write and I know basic arithmetic. I can sew a little and I can cook and clean, but I have no references, no one to vouch for me." "We will figure something out," Xander said, but even to his own ears it sounded weak. The truth was, he was not sure what she could do. Loveland was not a big town, and opportunities for unattached young women were limited at best. The silence stretched between them, heavy with unspoken worries. Finally, Julia spoke again, her voice barely above a whisper. "There is another option." "What is that?" "I could marry." She said it flatly, without emotion. "That is what women in my position do, is it not? Find a man who needs a wife and hope he is not a monster." Xander felt something twist in his chest. The idea of this woman, brave and desperate and beautiful, having to marry some stranger just to survive made him angry in a way he did not fully understand. "That is not a decision you need to make right now," he said firmly. "Like I said, we will figure something out." She looked at him for a long moment, her green eyes searching his face. "You are a kind man, Mr. Ingram, but we both know the reality of the situation. I have no money, no family, no prospects. The only thing I have to offer is myself as a wife. Maybe if I am lucky, I will find someone decent." "Or maybe you will find another option," Xander said. "Give it time." She smiled then, a sad small smile that did not reach her eyes. "Time is a luxury I cannot afford, but I appreciate your optimism." She closed her eyes after that, and soon her breathing evened out into sleep once more. Xander sat there watching her, his mind churning with thoughts he was not quite ready to examine too closely. He had only known this woman for a day, and most of that time she had been unconscious. Yet something about her had gotten under his skin, made him want to protect her, to help her in a way that went beyond simple charity. He forced himself to stand and go about his chores. The animals needed tending, and he needed to shovel a path from the house to the barn. The physical labor helped clear his head, and by the time he came back inside a few hours later, he had made a decision. It was a crazy decision, one that would change his life in ways he could not predict. But as he looked at Julia Reeves sleeping in his bed, fragile and strong all at once, he knew it was the right one. When she woke again that evening, he was sitting by the fire, and she could tell from his face that something had changed. "Miss Reeves," he said, his voice steady but his eyes betraying his nervousness. "I have a proposition for you." She pulled herself up to sitting, wincing at the soreness in her muscles. "What kind of proposition? Marry me?" The words hung in the air between them. Julia stared at him, her mouth falling open slightly. "What? Marry me?" Xander repeated. "I know it sounds insane, we do not know each other, but hear me out. You need a home and security. I have both. This ranch is small, but it is mine, free and clear. I have a herd of cattle and enough land to make a decent living. What I do not have is a wife, someone to share the work and the life." "But you do not know me," Julia said, echoing his own words. "I could be anyone, I could be terrible." "Could you?" He leaned forward, his elbows on his knees. "I do not think so. I think you are a woman who has been dealt a hard hand and is trying to make the best of it. I think you are brave, braver than you know. You rode alone across half of Colorado in the winter. That takes courage. That takes desperation," she corrected. "Maybe. But desperation and courage often look the same." He took a breath. "I am not promising you a love match. I am not promising romance or grand gestures. What I can promise you is respect, a home, and a partnership. You would have a place here, a real place, not as a charity case but as my wife. You would share in the work and the rewards, and you would be safe." Julia was quiet for a long time, her hands twisting in the blanket. "Why?" she asked finally. "Why would you do this? You could find any woman to marry. You do not need to saddle yourself with someone like me. Someone like you." Xander's voice was sharp. "You mean someone who has had bad luck. Someone who needs help. Miss Reeves, I am 30 years old. I have been on my own for a long time. If I wanted to find a wife the traditional way, I would have done it by now. The truth is, I am not good with the courting and the social dances and all that. I am better with horses and cattle than I am with people. What I need is a partner, someone practical and strong. I think you might be that person. You think, or you know, I think. Which is why I am proposing we give it a trial period of sorts. We get married, legally and properly. But we give ourselves time to see if we can make it work as partners. If after a few months you are miserable and want to leave, I will give you money to go wherever you want and start over. But if we can make it work, then we have both gained something. Julia looked at him, really looked at him, as if seeing him for the first time. He was a handsome man in a rough-hewn way, tall and broad-shouldered with dark hair that curled slightly at the ends and eyes that were a warm brown. His face was weathered from years of outdoor work, but it was an honest face, with strong features and a mouth that looked like it smiled easily, though it was not smiling now. He was nervous, she realized. This whole speech, delivered with such confidence, was coming from a man who was genuinely nervous about her answer. "I do not love you," she said quietly. "I know. I do not love you either, but maybe we could build something anyway. People have made marriages work on less." "What would you expect from me?" "As your wife," Xander hesitated, choosing his words carefully. "I would expect you to help run the household, cooking, cleaning, those sorts of things. I can do them myself, but I will not lie and say I am good at them. I would expect you to help with the ranch when needed, during calving season or roundup, and I would expect honesty and loyalty. As for the more intimate aspects of marriage," he paused, his face coloring slightly, "that would be your choice. I would not force anything on you. If in time we grew to care for each other in that way, well, that would be something we decided together." Julia felt her own face flush at the delicate topic, but she appreciated his directness. "And if I say no?" "Then once you are well enough, I will take you into Loveland and help you find another situation. No hard feelings and no expectations. You would not owe me anything." She looked down at her hands, her mind racing. It was an insane proposition. She had known this man for less than a day. Marriage was supposed to be about love and romance, not practical arrangements made out of desperation. But then again, what choice did she really have? He was right about her situation. Without money or family, her options were severely limited. She could try to find work in Loveland, but with no references and no connections, that would be difficult at best. She could try to find another man to marry, but at least with Xander Ingram, she knew what she was getting into. He had saved her life and treated her with nothing but respect and kindness. "Can I think about it?" she asked. "Of course. Take all the time you need." But even as she said it, Julia knew what her answer would be. She had come to Colorado looking for a new start, for a place where she could belong. Maybe this was not the new start she had imagined, but it was better than the alternatives. And there was something about Xander Ingram, something solid and trustworthy, that made her want to take the risk. "I do not need time," she said, surprising herself. "My answer is yes, I will marry you." Xander's eyes widened slightly. "You are sure?" "I am sure. You are right. We could make a partnership work. And I would rather take my chances with a man who has shown me nothing but kindness than take my chances with strangers in town." She lifted her chin, meeting his gaze squarely. "But I have conditions." "Name them." "You said this would be a trial period. I want that in writing. If after 6 months either of us wants to end the marriage, we can do so without recrimination, and you will give me enough money to start somewhere new." "Agreed. Agreed. And I want to be a real partner. I will not be treated as a servant or a burden. If I have ideas about the ranch or the household, I want you to listen to them. I may not know much about ranching now, but I can learn." "Agreed. Agreed. Anything else?" "Yes, I want honesty between us, always, no matter how uncomfortable the truth might be." Xander stood and crossed to the bed, extending his hand. "You have my word, Miss Reeves. Honesty, partnership, and respect. That is what I offer you." Julia took his hand and they shook on it like two businessmen sealing a deal. But as their hands clasped, she felt a small spark of something she could not quite name. It was not love, not yet. But it was the possibility of something more, and right now, that was enough. The next few days passed in a strange sort of domesticity. Julia was still recovering from her ordeal, though she improved rapidly. Xander insisted she stay in bed and rest, but she was stubborn and insisted on getting up and helping with small tasks. They compromised, with her doing light chores like mending and food preparation, while sitting in the chair by the fire. They talked during those days, getting to know each other in the way that two strangers who had agreed to marry probably should. Xander told her about his life, how he had come to Colorado 10 years earlier with his parents, homesteading and building the ranch from nothing. His parents had died 5 years ago, his father in a fall from a horse and his mother from pneumonia the following winter. Since then, he had been running the ranch alone, building it up slowly but surely. Julia told him about her own life in Kansas, about growing up on a small farm with parents who had loved her but struggled to make ends meet. About the cholera epidemic that had taken them both within days of each other, and the cold reception she had received from her aunt, who had never approved of her father's choice to farm rather than pursue more respectable work. They discovered they had things in common: a love of reading, though books were scarce on the frontier, a dry sense of humor, and a practical outlook on life. They also discovered their differences. Xander was methodical and patient, while Julia tended toward impulsiveness. He was quiet and introspective, while she was more talkative and expressive. But somehow, the differences seemed to complement rather than clash. A week after Julia's rescue, Xander decided she was well enough to travel the short distance into Loveland. They needed to make their arrangement official, and that meant finding a preacher or a judge to perform the ceremony. The weather had cleared, and though the roads were still treacherous with snow and ice, Copper was sure-footed enough to make the trip. Julia borrowed some of Xander's clothes for the journey, as her own dress had been ruined beyond repair. She looked odd in a man's shirt and trousers, but she was practical enough not to care about appearances. Xander gave her his heavy coat, and they set out mid-morning with Julia riding behind him on Copper. Loveland was a small town, just a main street with a handful of buildings. A general store, a saloon, a church, a smithy, and a few other establishments. It was the kind of place where everyone knew everyone, and strangers were noticed immediately. Xander could feel the curious stares as they rode down the main street, and he knew there would be talk. A man riding in with a woman dressed in his clothes was bound to cause gossip. He pulled up in front of the church, a small white building with a simple steeple. The preacher, Reverend Samuel Hayes, was a good man in his 50s who had been serving the community for years. Xander had known him since his family first arrived in the territory. They dismounted, and Xander helped Julia down. She looked nervous, he noticed, her hands fidgeting with the two long sleeves of the shirt she wore. He wanted to reassure her, but what could he say? They were about to marry, two virtual strangers, and there was no way to make that less strange. The church was empty when they entered, but they found Reverend Hayes in the small office at the back, working on his sermon for the coming Sunday. He looked up when they entered, his kind, weathered face breaking into a smile of welcome that faltered slightly when he got a good look at Julia's appearance. "Xander, my boy, what brings you to town? And who is this young lady?" "Reverend Hayes, this is Miss Julia Reeves. She had an accident on the road during the storm last week. I found her and took her back to my ranch to recover." Xander kept his voice steady and matter-of-fact. "We are here because we would like you to marry us." The Reverend's eyebrows shot up so high they nearly disappeared into his hairline. "Marry you? But Xander, you have only just met this young lady. Surely you do not mean to rush into something so serious." "With all due respect, Reverend, I am 30 years old and I know my own mind. Miss Reeves and I have discussed this thoroughly. We want to be married, and we want to do it properly with God's blessing." Reverend Hayes turned his attention to Julia. "Miss Reeves, is this what you want? You are not being coerced in any way." Julia lifted her chin, and Xander felt a flash of pride at her courage. "No one is forcing me, Reverend. Mr. Ingram has been nothing but kind and respectful. I came to Colorado to start a new life, and this is the opportunity I have been given. I am entering this marriage of my own free will." The Reverend looked between them, clearly troubled. "Marriage is a sacred institution, blessed by God. It is not something to be entered into lightly or for reasons of mere convenience." "I understand that," Xander said. "And I assure you we are not taking this lightly. But the fact is, Miss Reeves needs a home and I need a wife. We are both practical people and we believe we can make this work." "What about love?" the Reverend asked quietly. "Marriage without love is a hollow thing." "Perhaps," Julia said softly, "but marriage without respect or partnership is worse. Mr. Ingram offers me both. Love may come in time or it may not, but we are willing to build something together, and that is a start." Reverend Hayes sighed deeply. "You are both adults and I cannot stop you. But I would ask that you wait at least a few days. Give yourselves time to be absolutely certain this is what you want." "We are certain," Xander said firmly. "And every day we wait is another day Miss Reeves is living under my roof without the protection of marriage. I will not have her reputation compromised any more than it already has been." That argument seemed to sway the Reverend. In a small town like Loveland, reputation was everything, and an unmarried woman living alone with a man was a scandal waiting to happen. "Very well," he said finally. "I will perform the ceremony. But I pray you are both making the right decision." The ceremony was brief and simple. There were no flowers, no music, no guests. Just Xander and Julia standing before the Reverend in the small church, speaking vows that felt both momentous and surreal. Xander's voice was steady as he promised to honor and protect her. Julia's voice trembled slightly as she promised the same, but she did not falter. When it came time to exchange rings, Xander realized with embarrassment that he had not thought to bring any. But Reverend Hayes produced 2 simple gold bands from his desk, wedding rings from a couple who had died without heirs and had left them to the church. They were worn and plain, but they would serve. "You may kiss your bride," the Reverend said finally, and Xander turned to Julia with a mixture of nervousness and something else he could not quite name. Their first kiss was chaste and brief, just a light touch of lips that lasted barely a second. But as Xander pulled back and looked into Julia's green eyes, he felt that spark again, that sense of possibility. They were married now. She was his wife. He had called her that from the moment he brought her into his home, but now it was true in every legal and spiritual sense. They signed the marriage certificate, and Reverend Hayes added his own signature as witness. "May God bless your union," he said, though he still looked troubled. "And Xander, please bring your wife to Sunday services. I would like to get to know her better." "We will," Xander promised. He paid the Reverend for his services and led Julia back outside. The general store was their next stop. Julia needed clothes and other necessities, and Xander wanted to pick up supplies while they were in town. The store was run by a woman named Margaret Thorne, a widow in her 40s who knew everything that happened in Loveland and was not shy about sharing her opinions. Her eyes went wide when Xander and Julia walked in together. "Xander Ingram, is that you? And who is this young lady you have brought with you?" "Mrs. Thorne, I would like to introduce my wife, Julia Ingram." He felt a small thrill of satisfaction saying it out loud for the first time. "We were just married at the church." Margaret's mouth fell open. "Married? But when did you even meet?" "I have not heard anything about you courting anyone." "It was rather sudden," Xander admitted. "But when you know, you know." Margaret looked Julia up and down, taking in her borrowed men's clothes and the fading bruises on her face. Julia met her gaze steadily, not flinching from the scrutiny. After a moment, Margaret's expression softened. "Well then, congratulations to you both. I suppose your bride will be needing some proper clothes." "Yes, madam," Julia said. "Everything I had was lost in an accident. I need dresses, undergarments, shoes, everything really." "We will take care of you, dear. Come with me to the back and we will see what we have that will fit." While Julia was outfitting herself with the help of Mrs. Thorne, Xander gathered supplies: flour, sugar, coffee, bacon, and other staples. He also picked out a few small luxuries: ribbons for Julia's hair, a bar of scented soap, a book of poetry he thought she might enjoy. He was not a romantic man by nature, but something in him wanted to give her these small things, to make her feel welcome in her new life. By the time they left the store, laden with packages, it was mid-afternoon. They stopped at the small restaurant on the main street for a meal, their first as husband and wife. The food was simple but good: beef stew and fresh bread, and they ate in comfortable silence. As they were finishing, a man approached their table. He was in his 50s with a sheriff's badge pinned to his vest. "Xander," he said with a nod. "Heard you got yourself married today. Congratulations." "Thank you, Sheriff Martin. This is my wife, Julia." The sheriff tipped his hat to her. "Madam, welcome to Loveland." His expression turned more serious as he looked at Xander. "Mind if I have a word with you outside?" Xander felt a prickle of unease but nodded. "Of course. Julia, I will be right back." Outside, the sheriff wasted no time getting to the point. "That woman in there, your wife, where did she come from?" "Kansas. She was traveling to Loveland to stay with her uncle, John Reeves, but he died before she arrived. I found her on the road during the storm last week, half dead from cold and injury." "And you married her, just like that?" "Just like that," Xander said evenly. "Is there a problem, Sheriff?" "Maybe, maybe not. I got a telegram a few days ago from a sheriff in Denver. He was asking if we had seen a young woman matching your wife's description. Said she was wanted for questioning in connection with a theft." Xander felt his stomach drop. "Theft? What kind of theft?" The telegram did not say. But it did give a description: early 20s, dark hair, green eyes, traveling alone. That sound familiar. "That could describe a lot of women," Xander said, but his voice lacked conviction. "Could be. But how many young women traveling alone ended up in Loveland in the middle of a blizzard?" The sheriff's gaze was sharp but not unkind. "Look, Xander, I know you. You are a good man and you have always been honest with me. If you married this woman, I am sure you had your reasons. But I need to ask her about this telegram. If she is innocent, she has nothing to worry about." Xander wanted to argue, to defend Julia without even knowing what she was accused of. But he had promised her honesty, and that meant getting to the truth, even if it was uncomfortable. "All right," he said. "Ask your questions, but do it respectfully. She is my wife now, and I will not have her treated like a criminal without cause." They went back inside, and the sheriff pulled up a chair to their table. Julia looked between them, her face pale. "What is wrong?" "Madam, I need to ask you some questions," the sheriff said. "I received a telegram from Denver asking about a woman matching your description. It said she was wanted for questioning regarding a theft. Do you know anything about that?" Julia's hands clenched in her lap. "I know what you are talking about," she said quietly, "but I did not steal anything." "Then maybe you should tell me what happened." She took a deep breath, and Xander could see the effort it took for her to compose herself. "When I was in Denver, waiting for the stage, I stayed at a boarding house run by a woman named Mrs. Cartwright. She was kind at first, but after a few days, she started making suggestions about how I could earn extra money. She wanted me to entertain male guests, if you understand my meaning." The sheriff nodded, his expression neutral. "I refused, of course. I am not that kind of woman. But Mrs. Cartwright said if I was not going to help her earn money, I needed to pay more for my room. She kept raising the price every day until I was running out of funds. I knew she was trying to trap me, to force me into a situation where I would have no choice. So I left early one morning without paying for the last 2 days I had stayed. She must have reported it as theft." "Did you take anything else? Any property or money?" "No." Julia's voice was fierce. "I only took what was mine. I am not a thief. I just could not stay there any longer." The sheriff was quiet for a moment, then nodded. "I believe you. Women like Mrs. Cartwright are known to law enforcement. She has been accused of running what amounts to a brothel more than once, though nothing has ever been proven. If your story is true, and I have no reason to doubt it, then you were right to leave." "So she is not in trouble?" Xander asked. "Not from me. I will send a telegram back to Denver explaining the situation. Mrs. Cartwright might try to pursue it, but I doubt it. She would not want the attention an investigation would bring." He stood and tipped his hat to Julia. "Mrs. Ingram, I apologize for any distress this caused. Welcome to Loveland." After the sheriff left, Xander reached across the table and took Julia's hand. She was trembling slightly, he realized. "Why did you not tell me about that?" he asked gently. "I was afraid," she admitted. "I thought if you knew I was accused of theft, even falsely, you might not want to marry me. I know I should have told you, but I was so desperate for a chance at a new life." "We promised each other honesty," Xander reminded her. "That means telling the truth, even when it is hard." "I know. I am sorry. It will not happen again." He squeezed her hand. "I believe you. And for what it is worth, even if you had told me, I still would have married you. I knew you were in trouble. That was part of why I wanted to help." Her eyes filled with tears, and she blinked rapidly, trying to hold them back. "You really are a good man, Xander Ingram. I hope I can be worthy of that." "You already are," he said simply. They rode back to the ranch in the late afternoon, the winter sun already starting to sink toward the horizon. Julia held the packages from the general store while Xander guided Copper along the snowy road. By the time they arrived home, they were both cold and tired, but there was a sense of accomplishment too. They had made their arrangement official. They were truly married now, for better or worse. That first night as husband and wife was awkward. They had not discussed the sleeping arrangements, and now it loomed large between them. The cabin only had one bedroom, one bed. Xander had been sleeping on the floor since Julia arrived, but now that they were married, the question of what was appropriate had shifted. "I can continue sleeping by the fire," Xander said as they finished a simple dinner. "I do not want you to feel pressured about anything." Julia was quiet for a moment. "We are married," she said finally, "and that bed is big enough for 2 people. I trust you, Xander. We can share the bed without anything inappropriate happening. But if you would be more comfortable on the floor, I understand." Xander thought about it. The floor was cold and uncomfortable, and his back had been aching from the hard surface. And she was right. They were married. "If you are sure you would not mind, then yes. We can share the bed." That night they lay on opposite sides of the bed, a careful distance between them. Xander was acutely aware of her presence, the sound of her breathing, the warmth of her body. It felt both natural and strange, intimate without being improper. He fell asleep thinking that maybe, just maybe, they could make this arrangement work. The weeks that followed fell into a comfortable rhythm. Julia proved to be a hard worker, taking over the cooking and cleaning and throwing herself into learning about ranch life. She was not afraid of hard work, and she asked questions constantly, wanting to understand everything from how to milk the cow to how to check cattle for illness. Xander found himself enjoying her company more than he had expected. She was quick-witted and funny, with a sharp tongue when something amused or annoyed her. They talked while they worked, sharing stories and opinions on everything from politics to literature to the best way to make biscuits. Sometimes they sat by the fire in the evenings, reading aloud to each other from the few books they had. It was a simple life, but there was a contentment to it that Xander had not felt in years. They attended church on Sundays, and gradually Julia was accepted into the community. The women of Loveland were curious about her, and some were judgmental about the hasty marriage, but Julia won them over with her genuine kindness and willingness to help. She joined the church quilting circle and volunteered to help teach reading to some of the younger children in town. Xander watched her integrate into the community and felt proud. She was making this place her home. But as the weeks turned into months, Xander became aware of a shift in his feelings. He had married Julia out of a sense of duty and practicality, offering her a solution to her desperate situation while gaining a partner for himself. But somewhere along the way, it had become more than that. He looked forward to seeing her smile. He loved the way she laughed at his jokes, even the bad ones. He found himself thinking about her when he was out working, wondering what she was doing, if she was happy. He was falling in love with his wife. The realization hit him one evening in early spring. The snow had finally melted, and the first green shoots of grass were appearing in the fields. They were sitting outside on the porch, watching the sun set over the mountains. Julia was mending one of his shirts, her fingers moving with practiced ease, and the golden light of the sunset caught in her hair, turning it to burnished bronze. She looked up and caught him staring. "What?" she asked, a smile playing at the corners of her mouth. "Nothing," he said, but his voice came out rough. "Just thinking how glad I am that I found you under that tree." Her smile widened. "I am glad you found me too. I cannot imagine my life any other way now." "Julia," he said, setting down the piece of leather he had been working on. "Can I ask you something, of course? Are you happy? Here, I mean with this life, with me." She set aside her mending and turned to face him fully. "Yes," she said simply. "I am happy. Happier than I have been in a long time. This is not the life I imagined for myself, but it is a good life. You have given me so much, Xander. A home, a purpose, a place where I belong. How could I not be happy?" "And what about us?" He hesitated, not sure how to phrase what he wanted to ask. "Do you think we could be more than just partners, more than just a practical arrangement?" Julia's breath caught. "What are you saying?" "I am saying that I have feelings for you, real feelings. I did not expect it to happen, but it has. I think I am falling in love with you." The words came out in a rush, and he felt his face heat with embarrassment. "I know that was not part of our agreement. You do not have to feel the same way. I just thought you should know." For a long moment, Julia just stared at him, her green eyes wide. Then slowly, a smile spread across her face, bright and genuine. "You fool," she said softly. "I have been in love with you for weeks." Xander felt his heart jump. "You have?" "Yes. I tried not to be. I kept telling myself it was just gratitude or that I was confusing partnership with affection. But the truth is, you are the best man I have ever known. You are kind and patient and funny, and you make me feel safe in a way I never have before. How could I not fall in love with you?" He reached for her hand, and she laced her fingers through his. "So what do we do now?" he asked. "I think we stop pretending this is just a practical arrangement," she said. I think we accept that this marriage has become real in every way." Xander stood and gently pulled her to her feet. This time when he kissed her, it was not the chaste brush of lips from their wedding day. It was deep and searching, a promise and a question all at once. Julia melted into him, her arms wrapping around his neck, and Xander felt a sense of rightness settle over him. This was where he was meant to be, with this woman in his arms. That night, their marriage became complete in every sense. They came together with a mixture of nervousness and desire, learning each other's bodies with gentle care. Afterward, lying tangled together in the bed they had shared for months, Xander felt a peace he had not known was possible. "I love you," he whispered into her hair. "I love you too," she whispered back. The seasons turned. Spring gave way to summer, and the ranch thrived under their combined efforts. Julia learned to ride properly, and she often accompanied Xander when he rode out to check on the cattle. They worked together during the hay harvest, long days of backbreaking labor that left them exhausted but satisfied. In the evenings, they would sit on the porch, watching the stars come out and making plans for the future. They talked about expanding the herd, about building an addition onto the house, about all the things they could accomplish together. The 6-month trial period they had agreed upon came and went without either of them mentioning it. There was no need. They both knew this was permanent. In late summer, Julia realized she was pregnant. She had suspected for a few weeks, but she waited to be sure before telling Xander. When she finally did, his reaction was everything she could have hoped for. His face lit up with joy, and he picked her up and spun her around, laughing. "We are going to have a baby," he said wonderingly. "You are going to be a mother and I am going to be a father. Are you happy?" she asked, though she could see the answer in his eyes. "Happy does not begin to cover it," he said. "I am ecstatic, I am terrified, I am grateful." He cupped her face in his hands. "Thank you for giving me this, for giving us this." The pregnancy was not easy. Julia suffered from sickness in the early months, and as she grew larger, the physical labor of ranch life became more difficult. But Xander was attentive and protective, taking on more of the work and fussing over her in a way that was both endearing and sometimes annoying. She loved him for it anyway. The women of Loveland rallied around her, offering advice and hand-me-down baby clothes. Margaret Thorne from the general store became a particular friend, stopping by the ranch regularly to check on Julia and bring treats. Even Reverend Hayes, who had been skeptical about their hasty marriage, admitted that he had been wrong to doubt them. "You two have built something real," he told them one Sunday after services. "You have proven that a marriage built on respect and partnership can grow into real love. That is a rare and beautiful thing." In early February, almost a year to the day after Xander had found Julia under that tree, she went into labor. It was a long and difficult process, made more frightening by the fact that the midwife from town was stranded by another unexpected snowstorm. Xander was forced to deliver the baby himself, guided by instructions from Margaret Thorne, who had managed to make it to the ranch before the worst of the storm hit. He had never been so scared in his life, but he pushed through the fear, focusing on Julia's needs. She was strong and brave, even in the midst of terrible pain, and when their baby finally entered the world with a loud, healthy cry, Xander felt tears streaming down his face. "It is a boy," Margaret announced, wrapping the baby in a clean blanket. "A fine, healthy boy." Xander placed their son in Julia's arms, and the look of pure love on her face as she gazed down at their child was something he would remember for the rest of his life. "What should we name him?" she asked softly. They had discussed names, but had not settled on anything. Now, looking at his son, Xander knew. "Daniel," he said. "After my father." Julia smiled. "Daniel Ingram, it is perfect." The months that followed were exhausting and wonderful in equal measure. Daniel was a demanding baby, waking frequently in the night and requiring constant attention. But he was also a happy child, quick to smile and laugh, and watching him grow and change was a joy unlike anything Xander had ever experienced. Julia was a natural mother, patient and loving even when she was running on little sleep. Xander did his best to help, taking turns walking the baby when he fussed and changing diapers without complaint. They were a team, just as they had promised each other they would be. As Daniel grew from an infant into a toddler, the ranch continued to prosper. Xander had built up his herd significantly, and he was making a good profit selling cattle to the markets in Denver. With the extra money, he was able to add on to the house, building 2 more bedrooms and a larger kitchen. Julia made the house a home, filling it with small touches that made it warm and welcoming. They attended church regularly, and their standing in the community was solid. Julia had become an integral part of Loveland, known for her kindness and her willingness to help anyone in need. Xander was respected as a hard worker and an honest man. Together, they were seen as a model couple, proof that even the most unlikely unions could succeed with effort and commitment. When Daniel was 3 years old, Julia became pregnant again. This time, the pregnancy was easier, and when the time came, she delivered a healthy baby girl with the help of the midwife and Margaret Thorne. They named her Sarah after Julia's mother. With 2 children, life on the ranch was busier than ever. But it was also richer, filled with the laughter and chaos that children brought. Daniel was a curious and energetic boy, always getting into something, while Sarah was quieter and more contemplative, content to sit and watch the world around her. Years passed in a blur of seasons and growth. Daniel grew tall and strong, learning the work of the ranch from his father. Sarah showed an aptitude for reading and writing, and Julia taught her at home, using the books they had gradually accumulated over the years. They added a 3rd child, another boy they named Thomas, who had his mother's green eyes and his father's stubborn determination. Through it all, Xander and Julia's love only deepened. They had built a life together from nothing, creating a family and a home out of desperation and chance. But it had become so much more than that. They were partners in every sense, sharing the work and the joys and the struggles. Sometimes, on quiet evenings when the children were asleep, they would sit on the porch and look up at the stars, just as they had in those early days. "Do you ever think about that night?" Julia asked one such evening. "When you found me under the tree?" "All the time," Xander admitted. "I think about how easily it could have gone differently. If I had taken a different road, if the storm had been worse, if I had not seen your trail. We would never have met." "I was so scared that night," Julia said softly. "I thought I was going to die alone in the cold, and then you appeared like an answer to a prayer I had not even thought to make." "I told people you were my wife before we were even married," Xander said. "From the moment I carried you into this house, I think some part of me knew you were meant to be here." Julia reached for his hand. "You saved my life that night, but you did more than that. You gave me a home, a family, a reason to live. You gave me love when I had nothing." "We saved each other," Xander corrected. "I was alone in this house, going through the motions of life without really living. You brought light and laughter and purpose. You made this house a home. You made me complete." She leaned her head on his shoulder, and they sat in comfortable silence, watching the stars wheel overhead. They had faced challenges over the years, droughts and harsh winters, sickness and injury, the constant struggle of making a living from the land. But they had faced it all together, and that had made all the difference. As Daniel grew into a young man, he began to take on more responsibility for the ranch. He was a good worker, steady and reliable, and Xander was proud of the man his son was becoming. Sarah showed an interest in teaching, and Julia worked with her to ensure she had the education she would need to pursue that path. Thomas was still young, but he was already showing signs of being every bit as stubborn and determined as his parents. One autumn evening, when Xander was in his early 50s and Julia in her early 40s, they found themselves alone on the porch once again. The children were all inside, Daniel helping Sarah with her studies while Thomas played with his toy horses. The air was crisp with the promise of winter, and Xander felt a sense of nostalgia wash over him. 20 years, he said quietly. It has been 20 years since I found you. Julia smiled, her face lined now with the years but still beautiful to him. 20 years. Can you believe it? Sometimes yes, sometimes no. Some days it feels like yesterday. Other days it feels like you have always been here, like I cannot remember a time before you. I feel the same way. She turned to look at him. If you could go back and change anything, would you? Xander did not even have to think about it. Not a single thing. Every moment, good and bad, led us here. I would not trade this life for anything. Neither would I. She stood and held out her hand. Come on, old man. Let us go inside and enjoy our family. He took her hand, marveling as he always did at how perfectly it fit in his. They had started as strangers, two desperate people making a practical arrangement. But they had built something beautiful together, a love that had grown and deepened with every passing year. As they walked inside, Xander looked around at the home they had made. The walls were decorated with drawings the children had made over the years. The kitchen smelled of the bread Julia had baked that morning. The fire crackled cheerfully in the hearth, and the sound of his children's voices filled the air. This was what he had saved Julia for, not just to give her survival, but to give her life. And in doing so, he had given himself the same gift. They had saved each other, and together, they had built something that would last long after they were gone. Daniel was 18 now, a full-grown man who was starting to talk about finding land of his own someday. Sarah was 15, smart and determined, already making plans to become a teacher in Loveland. Thomas was 10, still young but growing fast. Xander knew that in a few short years, the children would begin to leave, starting lives and families of their own. The thought filled him with both sadness and pride. But for now, they were all here together. And as Xander sat down in his chair by the fire, with Julia beside him and his children around him, he felt a peace that went bone deep. He had everything he had ever wanted, even things he had not known to want until Julia came into his life. That night, as they prepared for bed, Julia paused by the window, looking out at the snow that had begun to fall. "It is snowing," she said softly, "just like that night." Xander came to stand behind her, wrapping his arms around her waist. "Are you warm enough?" he asked, echoing the concern that had driven him that long-ago night. She turned in his arms and smiled up at him. "I am always warm when I am with you." They kissed, a gentle meeting of lips that still held the spark of passion even after all these years. When they finally pulled apart, Xander rested his forehead against hers. "I love you, Julia Ingram. I loved you the moment I saw you, even if I did not know it then. And I will love you until my last breath." "And I love you," she whispered back. "You were my salvation, my partner, my best friend, and the love of my life. Everything good in my world started the night you found me." They climbed into bed, the same bed they had shared for 20 years, and held each other close as the snow fell outside. Xander thought about the young man he had been, alone and lonely, following a trail of blood through the snow on a cold winter night. He thought about the scared, desperate woman he had found, half dead but still fighting to survive. Neither of them could have known then where that night would lead. They could not have imagined the love they would find, the family they would build, the life they would create together. It had started with a simple act of kindness, one person helping another in need. But it had grown into something so much larger and more beautiful than either of them could have dreamed. The snow continued to fall, blanketing the ranch in white silence. Inside the warm house, the Ingram family slept peacefully, secure in the love that bound them together. And in the master bedroom, Xander and Julia held each other close, grateful for every twist of fate that had brought them to this moment. They had started with nothing but desperation and hope. They had built a marriage on pragmatism and necessity, but they had transformed it into something rare and precious, a love that was both passionate and practical, romantic and real. They had proven that the best love stories are not the ones that start with fireworks and grand gestures, but the ones that grow slowly and steadily, rooted in respect and partnership and everyday kindness. As the years continued to pass, Xander and Julia grew old together. They watched their children become adults, start families of their own, and give them grandchildren. The ranch changed hands gradually, with Daniel taking over more and more of the operations as Xander's joints grew stiff with arthritis. Sarah became a beloved teacher in Loveland, inspiring a generation of children with her passion for learning. Thomas eventually bought his own piece of land nearby, starting his own ranch with his father's guidance. But through all the changes, one thing remained constant: the love between Xander and Julia. Even when Xander's hair went completely gray and Julia's face became lined with wrinkles, they still looked at each other with the same wonder and affection they had felt in those early days. They still held hands when they walked. They still kissed goodnight every evening. They still talked for hours about everything and nothing. On their 40th wedding anniversary, their children threw them a party at the church in Loveland. It seemed like the whole town turned out to celebrate, filling the building with laughter and music. There was a cake, gifts, and speech after speech praising the couple who had become pillars of the community. When it was Xander's turn to speak, he stood with Julia by his side and looked out at the sea of faces, many of them people they had known for decades. "Most of you know our story," he said. "How I found Julia on the side of the road during a blizzard, half dead from cold and injury. How I brought her home and married her within a week." There was laughter at this, the story having become something of a legend in Loveland. "What you might not know," Xander continued, "is that I told people she was my wife before we were even married. From the moment I carried her into my house, something in me recognized her as mine. It was not love at first sight, not exactly. It was something deeper than that. It was recognition, like finding a piece of myself I had not known was missing." He turned to look at Julia, who had tears streaming down her face. "40 years we have been married, and every single day I have been grateful for that storm, for that chance that brought us together. You have been my partner, my best friend, my love, and my life. Everything good in my world started the night I found you shivering under that tree." Julia stood on tiptoe to kiss him, and the room erupted in applause. When the noise finally died down, Julia took her turn to speak. "Xander says he saved me that night," she said, her voice strong despite her tears. "And it is true, he did. But what he does not say is that I saved him too. We were both lost in our own ways, both alone and lonely. We came together out of necessity, but we stayed together out of love. We built this life one day at a time, one decision at a time, one act of kindness at a time, and I would not change a single moment of it." The party continued late into the night, but eventually, Xander and Julia made their way home to the ranch. Daniel drove them in his wagon and they sat in the back, wrapped in blankets against the cool evening air. "Tired?" Xander asked Julia as they pulled up to the house. Exhausted, she admitted, but happy, so very happy. They made their way inside, moving slowly with the caution of age. The house was quiet, all their grandchildren having gone home with their parents. It was just the two of them, as it had been in the beginning. As they prepared for bed, Xander found himself thinking about that night 40 years ago. He could still remember every detail. The blood on the snow, the sound of the wind, the weight of Julia in his arms as he carried her home. At the time, he had just been trying to do the right thing to help someone in need. He had not known he was carrying his future, his happiness, his entire world. "What are you thinking about?" Julia asked, settling into bed beside him. "That night," he said, "and how lucky I am." "We are both lucky," she corrected. "We found each other when we both needed it most." "That is a rare thing, Xander. Most people never find that kind of love." "I know." He pulled her close and she rested her head on his chest, her hand over his heart. "I love you, Julia, more now than ever. And I love you," she murmured, already half asleep, "always and forever." Xander lay awake for a while longer, listening to her breathing even out into sleep. He thought about the life they had built, the family they had raised, the love they had nurtured. He thought about all the challenges they had faced and overcome together. And he thought about how it had all started with a simple choice: to stop and help someone in need. If he had ridden past that day, if he had ignored the blood trail in the snow, everything would be different. He would be alone in this house, his life empty of the love and joy that Julia had brought. He would never have known his children, never held his grandchildren, never experienced the deep contentment that came from sharing your life with someone who truly understood you. But he had not ridden past. He had followed that trail, found Julia, and called her his wife. And in doing so, he had found himself. As sleep finally claimed him, Xander's last conscious thought was one of gratitude. Gratitude for storms and chance and the mysterious ways that life brings people together. Gratitude for a woman brave enough to say yes to a stranger's proposal. Gratitude for love that grows slowly and deeply, rooted in partnership and respect. They had started as strangers, two desperate people making the best of a bad situation. But they had become so much more. They had become partners, friends, lovers, and soulmates. They had built a life that mattered, raised children who made the world better, and loved each other through 4 decades of joy and sorrow. In the end, that was what mattered. Not how they started, but what they built together. Not the desperate circumstances that brought them together, but the choices they made every day to stay together, to work together, to love each other. The snow fell softly outside, covering the ranch in a blanket of white. Inside, Xander and Julia slept peacefully in each other's arms, two souls who had found their home in each other. And somewhere in the quiet night, their story became part of the legend of the West. The cowboy who found a woman shivering under a snowy tree, carried her home, called her his wife, and spent the rest of his life proving that love can bloom even in the coldest of winters. Years later, when both Xander and Julia had passed on peacefully in their sleep within days of each other, their children and grandchildren gathered to remember them. The stories were told and retold, how they met, how they married, how they built a life together from nothing. And every time the story was told, it ended the same way, with the reminder that the greatest love stories are not the ones that start with passion and romance, but the ones that grow from kindness, respect, and the daily choice to build something beautiful together. The ranch remained in the family for generations, passed down from parent to child, a testament to what Xander and Julia had built. And on snowy winter nights when the wind howled and the temperature dropped, there were those who swore they could still see them. Xander riding through the storm, following a trail of blood to find his destiny, and Julia waiting under a tree, cold and scared but about to be saved by a man who would become her everything. It was a story of survival and second chances, of practical decisions that became profound love, of two people who saved each other and built a life that mattered. It was a reminder that sometimes the best things in life come from the most unexpected places, and that love, true love, can grow anywhere if you are willing to nurture it. And so the story of Xander and Julia Ingram became part of the fabric of Loveland, Colorado, a tale told to children and grandchildren, a reminder that love is not just found, it is built, one day at a time, one act of kindness at a time, one choice at a time. It was a story that would be remembered long after the people who lived it had turned to dust, a testament to the power of love to transform lives and create something beautiful out of even the most desperate circumstances. The end came peacefully for both of them, as it should for people who had lived so fully and loved so well. And when they were laid to rest side by side in the small cemetery outside Loveland, their headstone bore a simple inscription chosen by their children. He found her in a storm and called her his wife. Together they built a love that weathered every season. It was the perfect epitaph for a love story that had started with chance and desperation, but had grown into something timeless and true. And as the seasons turned and the years passed, their story remained, a beacon of hope for anyone who believed that love could be found in the most unlikely places, and that sometimes the greatest adventures begin with a simple act of kindness on a cold winter's night.